Picture this: a room full of the world's top geneticists, decades of research behind them, billions of dollars spent, millions of DNA samples collected from every corner of the planet, from remote Arctic villages to equatorial rainforests, from ancient burial sites to modern city hospitals. These scientists had spent years waiting for this moment, the moment the data would finally speak. And when it did, the room went quiet. Not because the results were complicated, but because they were almost too simple, too clean, too devastating to the assumptions humanity had been carrying for centuries. We had always believed, on some level, that the differences between us ran deep, that the physical distinctions between populations reflected something fundamental, something written into our biology at the most basic level. Entire civilizations had been built on that belief. Wars had been fought over it. People had been enslaved, colonized, and exterminated because of it. The DNA didn't care about any of that. What the global comparison revealed was a number so small, so shockingly modest, that it forced an uncomfortable question, not just for science, but for every society on Earth. If the genetic difference between any two human beings, chosen at random from any two corners of the globe, is almost vanishingly small, then what exactly have we been fighting about? What were the walls built for? What justified the divisions? This is the story of what the science found, and why the world has never quite been able to fully absorb the answer. Hashtag the belief system science was built on. To understand why the discovery was so shocking, you have to understand what scientists and society at large believed before. The data arrived. For most of recorded history, humans sorted themselves by appearance. It was instinctive, immediate, and felt logical. People from different continents looked different. They had different features, different skin tones, different hair textures, different physical builds. And since those differences were visible and consistent, the assumption was that they reflected something deep and fixed in human biology. In the 18th and 19th centuries, early scientists tried to formalize this intuition. They created classification systems for human races, assigned numerical values to physical measurements, and built elaborate hierarchies claiming that some populations were naturally more intelligent, more civilized, or more capable than others. These ideas were not considered fringe. They were published in prestigious journals, taught in universities, and cited in courtrooms. Even as the most overtly racist versions of these theories were eventually discredited, particularly in the aftermath of World War II, a subtler version of the same assumption survived. It was the quiet, background belief that populations separated by geography and time must be significantly different at the biological level. That thousands of years of living in different climates, eating different foods, and facing different diseases would have produced genuinely distinct groups of people at the level of DNA. This wasn't an unreasonable assumption on its face. Evolution works through variation and selection. Isolated populations do develop unique adaptations. It seemed scientifically plausible, almost obvious, that the genetic gap between a man born in Norway and a woman born in Nigeria would be substantial, meaningful, perhaps even profound. When the Human Genome Project finally gave scientists the tools to test that assumption directly, the results were waiting, patient, precise, and completely indifferent to what anyone had expected to find. The Human Genome Project was announced in 1990 and completed in 2003. It was the most ambitious coordinated scientific effort since the space race. The goal was to read the complete sequence of human DNA, all 3 billion base pairs that make up the genetic instruction manual for a human being. 13 years. Over $3 billion. Thousands of scientists across 20 research institutions in 6 countries. When the first full genome sequence was completed, and researchers began comparing it with sequences from diverse populations around the world, a number emerged that became one of the most quoted and most misunderstood figures in modern science. Any two randomly selected humans on Earth share approximately 99.9% of their DNA. The genetic difference between any two people, regardless of where they were born, what they look like, or what their ancestors looked like, is roughly 0.1%. That fraction of a percent represents real variation. It is the source of all human physical diversity, all individual differences in biology, and the ancestral signals that allow geneticists to trace migration routes across continents. None of that is trivial. But the sheer scale of the similarity was something researchers had not fully anticipated. And the implications cascaded outward in every direction. For comparison, two chimpanzees living in different troops just a few hundred miles apart in Central Africa are more genetically different from each other than a person from Iceland is from a person from Papua New Guinea. The species that we had designated as intellectually and biologically inferior to humans, our closest living relative, actually contains more internal genetic diversity than our entire global population. There was more, and this part was even more startling. When scientists analyzed where the 0.1% variation actually lives in the genome, they discovered something that upended the logic of racial classification entirely. The genetic variation that exists within any single human population, within one ethnic group, one nationality, one region, is greater than the variation between populations on opposite sides of the planet. The differences inside groups are larger than the differences between groups. This single finding dismantled, at the genomic level, every scientific argument that had ever been used to treat human populations as fundamentally distinct biological categories. Once scientists had the tools to map human DNA at scale, they moved beyond similarity and began reading the directional story the genome was telling. If we are all this genetically close, where did we all come from? How did one species end up on every continent, in every climate, speaking thousands of languages while carrying essentially the same biological blueprint? The answer was written in genetic diversity itself, specifically, in which populations had the most of it. African populations, particularly those in sub-Saharan Africa, contain more internal genetic variation than all other human populations in the rest of the world combined. The San people of southern Africa, the Hadza of Tanzania, various ethnic groups across West and Central Africa. Their genomes contain the deepest, most ancient layers of human genetic history. The reason is straightforward. Humans have been in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. The longer a population has existed in a place, the more genetic variation it accumulates over time. Every non-African population, by contrast, shows clear signs of having descended from a much smaller founding group, a genetic bottleneck that scientists call the out-of-Africa migration. Roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago, a relatively small group of anatomically modern humans crossed out of Africa, likely through the Arabian Peninsula. They carried with them only a subset of the genetic diversity that existed in Africa at the time, like a small jar scooped from an enormous ocean. From that founding population, humans spread across the planet with extraordinary speed, at least in geological terms. One wave moved east, hugging the southern coastline of Asia, eventually crossing open water to reach Australia more than 50,000 years ago. Another branch pushed northward and westward into Central Asia and Europe. Thousands of years later, a separate population crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska and spread south through the Americas, reaching the southern tip of South America. Within a few thousand years of their arrival in the north, scientists can trace every step of this journey in the genetic data. Each population that split off from a previous one carries slightly less diversity than its source group, like a photocopy of a photocopy, slightly less sharp each time, but unmistakably connected to the original. When you line up the genetic diversity maps against the geography, the migration routes appear with stunning clarity, not as theory, as data. Every person alive today stands at the end of one of those routes. Every human being is the living product of that original journey. Just when the picture seemed to be coming into focus, the ancient Na studies arrived. And they revealed that the story of humanity was not a clean straight line. It was a web. Beginning in the late 2000s, scientists developed the technology to extract and sequence DNA from ancient human remains. Neanderthal bones that had been sitting in European cave deposits for 40,000 years. A finger bone discovered in a Siberian cave belonging to an entirely new group of ancient humans, later named the Denisovans, that no one had known existed until their DNA was read. Early modern human remains from sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia. And then the comparisons began. The results forced a fundamental rewrite of human prehistory. Modern humans, it turned out, did not simply replace the ancient populations they encountered as they expanded across the globe. They mixed with them, bred with them, incorporated them genetically into the human lineage that ultimately survived. If you have ancestry from outside sub-Saharan Africa, between 1 and 4% of your genome comes from Neanderthals. Not as a metaphor, not as a figure of speech. Actual Neanderthal DNA sequences, inherited through generations of interbreeding that occurred roughly 50,000 years ago, are present in your cells right now. People with European and East Asian ancestry carry the highest concentrations. Some of these Neanderthal gene variants influence immune function, meaning that ancient interbreeding may have given modern humans biological tools to survive diseases they had never encountered before. People with ancestry from parts of East Asia and Oceania carry an additional genetic inheritance from the Denisovans. Indigenous Australians, Melanesians, and some populations across Southeast Asia show the highest known levels of Denisovan ancestry. And among Tibetan populations, researchers discovered something remarkable: a specific genetic variant that enables their bodies to function efficiently at extreme altitude. The biological ability to thrive where most humans cannot breathe is Denisovan in origin. A people who disappeared from Earth tens of thousands of years ago left a survival tool encoded in the DNA of a modern mountain community. That inheritance is still functioning today. The human family tree, examined at the genomic level, is not a neat branching diagram. It is an ancient tangle of populations that met across hundreds of thousands of years, merged and diverged, contributed to each other and separated, leaving traces in living people that we are only now beginning to fully read. Here is where the science becomes impossible to separate from history and ethics. The data from global DNA comparisons does not exist in a vacuum. It emerged into a world that had spent centuries organizing itself around the premise of fundamental human difference. And what it found was not nuance, not complexity, not a mixed picture. It found that the biological foundation for racial hierarchy does not exist at the genomic level. Skin color, the most visible and historically loaded of all human traits, is controlled by a small number of genes and can shift dramatically in a population over just a few thousand years in response to ultraviolet radiation. It is one of the fastest changing traits in the human genome, which is precisely why populations living near the equator develop darker pigmentation while those at higher latitudes developed lighter skin. This adaptation is real and biologically meaningful, but it is, in genetic terms, superficial. A thin surface layer painted over a genome that is otherwise nearly identical across the entire species. Eye shape, hair texture, facial structure, these traits cluster geographically because they were shaped by local environments over thousands of years. But they represent a vanishingly small fraction of the genome. And critically, they do not correlate with the traits that actually matter most in human life: cognitive function, emotional complexity, creativity, resilience, moral capacity. The genome shows no population-level differences in any of these areas. None. This does not erase the reality of how race has functioned in human societies. The social construction was real. Its consequences were real. The violence, the dispossession, the generational wounds, those are real and they continue to shape the world. But the scientific claim that those hierarchies reflected natural biological truth? The genome refuses to support it. It never did. And now we have 3 billion data points to prove it. Step back from the laboratory for a moment and consider what this means at the level of human civilization. The population that gave rise to all modern humans outside Africa may have been shockingly small. Some genetic models suggest that as few as a few thousand individuals, one community, one extended group of families, were the ancestors of every non-African human being alive. Today, every empire, every dynasty, every culture that ever flourished outside the African continent traces back to that narrow passage. To a small group of people who walked out of one continent into an empty world and kept moving until they had filled it, and the total founding population for all of humanity, the group from which every single one of us descends, was never large by the standards of modern cities. We came extraordinarily close, at multiple points in our deep history, to not existing at all. Genetic evidence suggests that somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago, the entire human population may have dropped to just a few thousand breeding individuals, possibly fewer, the result of catastrophic climate events or ecological collapse. Our species nearly went extinct before it began. Every person alive is the improbable result of an unbroken chain of survival. Every grandmother and grandfather stretching back through thousands of generations who managed to survive long enough to have children. Break that chain anywhere, and none of us are here. The odds against any individual existing are so astronomically large that the number barely has meaning. We exist because they made it. All of them, across every continent, speaking every language, building every culture. The same species, carrying the same genome, expressing it in an infinite variety of ways. The scientists who spent their careers mapping human DNA were not philosophers. They were sequencing nucleotides, running algorithms, managing datasets measured in terabytes. But the accumulation of that work arrived at something that feels less like a laboratory result and more like a verdict. A verdict on the stories we told ourselves. We convinced ourselves, across centuries of recorded history, that the lines we drew between groups of people were natural, that the differences were deep, that they were written into the biology itself, permanent and fundamental, justifying whatever treatment those divisions produced. The science looked at those claims and said, no. The differences are real, but they are shallow. The divisions were always imposed, not discovered. The categories were constructed, not found. What the DNA comparison ultimately reveals is that every human being alive today is a member of one family, not poetically, literally. We share one origin point. We carry one ancestral population in our genome. We trace one path out of one continent into one planet that our species slowly came to occupy over 70,000 years of migration, adaptation, and survival. Along the way, we forgot that we were doing it together. We built the walls so high and kept them standing so long that they started to feel like they had always been there, like they were natural features of the landscape rather than things we built with our own hands. The genome remembers differently. It holds the record of every migration, every mixing, every ancient encounter between populations that thought they were strangers. It holds the Neanderthal sequences passed down through 2,000 generations. It holds the Denisovan altitude adaptation still functioning in Tibetan lungs. It holds the out-of-Africa bottleneck that connects a Norwegian fisherman to a Congolese farmer to a Peruvian shepherd through a single ancestral community that walked out of one continent tens of thousands of years ago and never stopped. The data is not a political statement. It is not an argument or an ideology. It is simply what was always there, waiting beneath the surface of every human body, every claimed division, every invented hierarchy. We are one species. We have one story. And for all the distance we have traveled, geographically, culturally, historically, the genome says we never actually drifted as far apart as we thought. That might be the most important thing a scientific instrument has ever told us. And the question now is whether we are finally ready to believe it.